This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. In the 1970s, California was gripped by a series of crimes that terrified residents and left law enforcement baffled for years. It began quietly, with a series of burglaries that seemed unrelated at first, occurring in suburban neighborhoods where families went about their daily lives, believing their streets were safe. But the pattern soon escalated, and the calm evenings of California's suburbs became fraught with fear. Residents recalled the unease as young women reported home invasions. The intruder would slip quietly into homes during the night, often when couples were asleep. He moved methodically, sometimes taking jewelry or small items, but more disturbing was his pattern of terror. He would tie up the victims, often ransacking rooms, and assault them before disappearing without leaving obvious traces. The attacks were terrifyingly personal, invasive, and methodical, leaving survivors traumatized and investigators struggling for answers. The crimes spread across Sacramento, Visalia, and a dozen other cities, covering hundreds of miles. Law enforcement initially believed they were dealing with a series of unconnected incidents, but careful analysis revealed a chilling link. The same perpetrator, a methodical and calculating individual, had left behind a distinct signature. He used his knowledge of neighborhoods to avoid detection, studying victims' routines, and he seemed to revel in instilling fear, often calling victims after the attacks to taunt them. The media dubbed him the Visalia Ransacker, early on, unaware that his crimes would escalate dramatically. By the late 1970s, the crimes escalated from burglary to sexual assault, and by the 1980s, he had graduated to murder. A string of homicides in Southern California shocked the region. Couples were attacked in their homes, shot or bludgeoned, leaving communities in a state of perpetual vigilance. Law enforcement agencies struggled to connect cases across jurisdictions, with local police departments and the FBI coordinating sporadically. The perpetrator's knowledge of police procedures, and his careful avoidance of leaving physical evidence, made him almost invisible. Despite his elusiveness, investigators had one breakthrough: biological evidence left at some of the crime scenes. Semen samples, hair fibers, and fingerprints were collected and stored, cataloged carefully, and preserved in evidence lockers. In the 1970s and 1980s, forensic technology had limited capacity to analyze DNA, and these samples could not yet yield conclusive results. Investigators relied on traditional methods: composite sketches, neighborhood canvassing, and interviews with potential suspects. But decades passed, and the case went cold repeatedly, leaving families without closure and law enforcement frustrated at the seemingly impossible task of identifying the perpetrator. As the years turned into decades, the Golden State Killer, as he came to be known, became a phantom in the public imagination. True crime enthusiasts pored over newspaper archives and crime reports, fascinated by the scale and audacity of his crimes. The FBI and local police continued to hold evidence, cataloged meticulously but unsolved. New technologies emerged, and cold case investigators began to revisit these decades-old files with renewed interest, hoping that the scientific advancements of the 21st century could provide a breakthrough where traditional methods had failed. In the early 2000s, a new technique began to transform cold case investigations: DNA profiling. Using biological samples that had been carefully preserved, forensic scientists could generate genetic profiles that were unique to each individual. Investigators uploaded these profiles to law enforcement databases in hopes of matching them to known offenders. While promising, initial attempts yielded no matches. The Golden State Killer's identity remained obscured, hidden behind the limitations of traditional criminal records. It was not until the mid-2010s that a novel approach bridged the gap between decades-old crime and modern technology: genetic genealogy. Investigators collaborated with genetic genealogists, analyzing DNA from crime scenes and comparing it to profiles in publicly available databases, often used for ancestry research. The technique involved identifying distant relatives of the suspect and building extensive family trees, narrowing the field of possible suspects based on inheritance patterns, geographic history, and age. It was painstaking work, requiring the synthesis of biology, genealogy, and detective work in a manner never before attempted on a case of this scale. By 2018, the team had narrowed the suspect list to a single individual, Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer with knowledge of criminal procedures and a seemingly ordinary life in California. Investigators confirmed the connection by obtaining a discarded DNA sample from D'Angelo, which matched the genetic material preserved from the 1970s and 1980s crime scenes. The verification was conclusive. The Golden State Killer had been identified decades after his reign of terror. D'Angelo was arrested quietly in his neighborhood, avoiding confrontation, and his home and personal effects were searched meticulously. Investigators recovered items that linked him further to his crimes, including letters, clothing, and photographs that corroborated the DNA evidence. News of the arrest spread rapidly, shocking communities that had lived with fear for generations and bringing a sense of relief to the surviving victims who had endured years of trauma. The arrest of Joseph D'Angelo was more than just the apprehension of a single individual. It represented a monumental shift in the way law enforcement approached cold cases. Evidence that had once seemed hopelessly old, collected decades earlier and stored meticulously, had finally yielded results. Families of victims, who had long hoped for closure, were finally able to begin processing justice, grief, and the end of uncertainty. The impact of DNA technology in this case reverberated across the nation, inspiring new investigations and renewed attention to other unsolved crimes. Throughout California, victims who had survived assaults in the 1970s and 1980s were contacted by investigators. Many struggled with a mixture of disbelief, relief, and lingering trauma. Counseling and support services were mobilized, as communities grappled with the enormity of what had been uncovered. Survivors recounted the terror of their experiences, the years of uncertainty, and the emotional weight of knowing the perpetrator had finally been brought to justice after decades. Law enforcement agencies meticulously documented the case, preserving the chronology of events, the DNA evidence, and the investigative techniques used to reach a resolution. Scholars, forensic scientists, and criminologists studied the case as a model for cold case investigation, emphasizing the integration of traditional detective work with cutting-edge genetic technology. It became a textbook example of how decades-old evidence could be leveraged with modern science to solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable. The Golden State Killer case was not just a resolution of individual crimes. It was a statement about persistence, patience, and innovation in law enforcement. The marriage of DNA technology and genealogical research had rewritten the rules of criminal investigation, allowing decades-old mysteries to be unraveled and perpetrators to face justice long after their initial crimes. Each strand of DNA, preserved in evidence lockers, became a testament to scientific foresight and meticulous record-keeping, ultimately leading to the capture of one of the most notorious criminals in American history. And so, the terror that had gripped California for over a decade in the 1970s and 1980s finally found its conclusion. What had once been a seemingly unsolvable puzzle, stretching across cities and decades, was finally resolved through the unassuming power of preserved DNA. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror, marked by fear, violence, and the inability of traditional policing methods to catch him, ended quietly in 2018, decades after his crimes, leaving behind a legacy of both horror and the triumph of forensic science. In the spring of 1986, the English countryside of Leicestershire was tranquil and picturesque, a place where narrow country lanes meandered past fields of crops, hedgerows, and scattered villages. It was a time of renewal and growth, yet beneath this serene landscape, a shocking act of violence would unsettle the small community of Narborough. Dawn Ashworth, a 16-year-old schoolgirl, had grown up in this quiet town. She was known among friends and neighbors as cheerful, curious, and bright, with a sense of independence that made her eager to explore the world beyond her immediate surroundings. On a typical spring day, Dawn left her home to attend school and run errands, her plans unremarkable in every way, yet they would become the last ordinary moments of her life. As she walked along familiar lanes, she encountered a man who would change the course of her life, and the history of British criminal investigation, forever. He approached her casually, blending into the environment, appearing non-threatening. Dawn, trusting and unaware of his intentions, engaged in conversation before being overpowered. The attack was sudden, violent, and precise, demonstrating a level of premeditation that would confound investigators for years. The perpetrator assaulted her and ultimately took her life, leaving her body in a secluded area near the village. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had known her since childhood were devastated, unable to reconcile the brutality of the act with the peaceful surroundings of their town. Law enforcement arrived promptly, cordoning off the area, gathering evidence, and interviewing anyone who might have seen something unusual that day. Initial investigations focused on immediate suspects and the local population. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, spoke with friends and family, and combed through any reports of suspicious individuals in the area. They attempted to establish a timeline, reconstruct Dawn's final movements, and identify anyone who might have had motive or opportunity. Yet despite their exhaustive efforts, the case remained stubbornly unsolved. Among the evidence collected at the scene were trace materials that would later prove critical: fibers, hairs, and biological samples from the perpetrator. At the time, forensic technology was limited. Investigators could examine blood types, hair characteristics, and other physical clues, but no method existed to definitively identify the individual who had committed the crime. These biological samples were preserved carefully, stored in evidence lockers with meticulous documentation, awaiting the day when technology might catch up with the crime. For months, the local police struggled with the lack of leads. Dawn's murder became one of Leicestershire's most pressing cases, drawing attention from the press and public alike. The community, desperate for justice, followed every update with anxiety, hoping that someone, anyone, would provide information to bring the perpetrator to account. The investigation spanned years, involving countless interviews, tip lines, and even revisiting older leads that initially seemed irrelevant. In 1987, a man named Colin Pitchfork, a local baker, became the focus of suspicion after an unrelated investigation. Pitchfork had briefly come under scrutiny due to rumors and minor behavioral oddities, but initial interviews and alibis allowed him to avoid serious suspicion. However, in a remarkable twist, forensic technology and investigative persistence intersected to provide a breakthrough that no one had anticipated. In one of the first instances of mass DNA testing in criminal investigation history, police conducted a voluntary DNA screening of local men to compare with the biological samples preserved from Dawn Ashworth's murder. Hundreds of individuals participated, but initial comparisons revealed no match. The investigation seemed to stall once again, leaving the case unresolved and the community in continued distress. Pitchfork, knowing he had evaded detection during the initial screening, attempted a deceptive tactic. He persuaded a colleague to submit a DNA sample in his place, hoping to divert suspicion entirely. This act of subterfuge initially delayed the investigation but ultimately proved futile. Forensic scientists, aware of the possibility of deceit, conducted follow-up testing and identified anomalies that prompted closer scrutiny of Pitchfork. The breakthrough came when investigators retested samples and directly matched the preserved biological material from the crime scene to Pitchfork. The precision of DNA profiling allowed them to conclusively identify him as the individual responsible for Dawn Ashworth's murder. It was a landmark moment in criminal justice, demonstrating the power of DNA to solve a case that had remained cold for over a year and to overcome attempts at evasion. Upon confirmation of the DNA match, law enforcement moved swiftly to apprehend Pitchfork. Officers conducted surveillance, planned the arrest meticulously, and approached him with caution to ensure a safe resolution. The arrest itself was carried out efficiently, with no resistance, as the weight of the evidence left him with no viable defense. Pitchfork's prior attempt to evade suspicion was irrelevant in the face of the incontrovertible DNA evidence now linking him to Dawn's murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Narborough and the surrounding communities. Residents struggled to comprehend the events. The seemingly ordinary man among them had committed such a violent and calculated crime. Families of victims, local authorities, and the public were both relieved and horrified, as the resolution of the case underscored the disturbing reality of criminal behavior hidden in plain sight. The legal proceedings that followed relied heavily on DNA evidence. Experts explained in court how biological samples collected at the scene, preserved over time, could now provide an exact match to the perpetrator. Forensic scientists detailed the testing procedures, the comparison of genetic markers, and the statistical certainty of the match. The courtroom became a place where science and justice converged, demonstrating the transformative impact of DNA in solving violent crimes. As Pitchfork was tried and convicted, the significance of the case extended beyond the immediate resolution of Dawn Ashworth's murder. The successful application of DNA profiling set a precedent in the United Kingdom and internationally, influencing the way law enforcement approached unsolved cases. Cold case units began to emerge, emphasizing the potential of preserved biological evidence to provide answers decades after a crime. The community responded in complex ways. On one hand, there was relief that the perpetrator had been identified and held accountable. On the other, there was a lingering sense of vulnerability, as residents reflected on the hidden dangers that had existed among them. Support services, counseling, and commemorative efforts were mobilized to help survivors and families cope with both the trauma and the closure brought by the resolution. In retrospect, Dawn Ashworth's murder stands as a testament to the evolution of forensic science and criminal investigation. The careful preservation of evidence, combined with innovation in DNA analysis, allowed law enforcement to solve a case that might otherwise have remained forever unresolved. Investigators' persistence, attention to detail, and willingness to embrace new methodologies exemplified the commitment to justice that ultimately prevailed. The story of Dawn Ashworth also influenced public awareness and policy. Communities began to recognize the importance of meticulous evidence collection, proper storage, and the potential for technological breakthroughs to reopen cold cases. The case became a reference point in discussions about DNA databases, ethical considerations, and the responsibility of law enforcement to pursue justice regardless of the time elapsed since a crime. And so, decades after that fateful spring day in 1986, the quiet countryside of Leicestershire witnessed the resolution of a crime that had haunted families and communities for years. Through the innovative application of DNA profiling, a perpetrator was brought to justice, and the memory of Dawn Ashworth was honored with closure that had long been denied. The case remains a landmark in the history of forensic science, demonstrating the extraordinary power of genetic evidence to illuminate the past and bring accountability where it was once impossible. In the summer of 1976, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Michigan, the routine hum of daily life masked an undercurrent of danger that few could have anticipated. The streets were lined with modest homes, their yards meticulously maintained, children played freely in the evenings, and neighbors greeted one another with a familiar warmth. Among them was Pamela Hutchinson, a young woman whose life had yet to unfold fully, whose days were filled with school, work, and the friendships of youth. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, Pamela went about her daily routine. She left her home for errands, walking familiar streets with the confidence of someone who knew her community well. Friends would later remember her bright smile, her laughter, and the sense of independence she carried as she navigated her surroundings. Yet on that day, an unseen danger lay in wait, poised to change the trajectory of her life and the lives of those who loved her. Pamela's encounter with her assailant was abrupt, violent, and unprovoked. Witnesses later reported seeing a stranger in the vicinity, someone who did not belong, moving with purpose and a disturbing familiarity with the area. The attack was swift and calculated, leaving Pamela dead and her neighborhood in shock. The crime scene was secured by local authorities, who began the painstaking process of gathering evidence, interviewing neighbors, and piecing together the movements of both victim and perpetrator. Law enforcement worked tirelessly to establish a profile of the assailant. Investigators collected fingerprints, hairs, and blood samples from the scene, meticulously cataloging every detail. They canvassed the community, interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, and tried to reconstruct Pamela's final moments. Yet despite their efforts, the perpetrator left few immediate clues. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual attack, no stolen items, and no overt signs pointing to a suspect in the hours following the murder. The investigation quickly reached a standstill. Law enforcement followed countless leads, many of which proved fruitless, and the case gradually cooled. As months turned into years, the crime remained unsolved, lingering in the collective consciousness of the neighborhood. Pamela's family struggled to reconcile the randomness and brutality of the act with the life of their loved one, holding on to hope even as the trail of evidence grew cold. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, advances in forensic science began to change the landscape of criminal investigation. Biological samples preserved from crime scenes, once only useful for blood typing and rudimentary analysis, gained new potential as technology improved. Hair fibers, semen, and blood samples could now be analyzed with increasing precision, offering the possibility of identifying individuals through their unique genetic profiles. Pamela's case, though decades old, remained carefully stored in evidence lockers, awaiting the day when scientific advances might unlock its secrets. In the early 2000s, investigators revisited cold cases across Michigan, re-examining evidence that had once seemed unhelpful. Pamela's case was prioritized due to the quality and preservation of biological samples. Modern DNA profiling, now capable of producing a detailed genetic fingerprint from minute traces, provided hope for resolution. Scientists extracted DNA from samples collected at the scene, generating a profile that could potentially be matched to suspects in law enforcement databases. Despite these advancements, the initial searches yielded no matches. The perpetrator had no prior record in the system that would link him directly to the crime. Investigators were forced to take a more creative approach, combining traditional detective work with new forensic possibilities. Cold case units meticulously cross-referenced known offenders, geographic data, and behavioral profiles to narrow the list of potential suspects. Every detail from the original investigation, from witness statements to physical evidence, was re-examined with fresh eyes. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to utilize genetic genealogy, a method that compares DNA from crime scenes to publicly available genealogical databases. By identifying distant relatives of the perpetrator, they could construct family trees and narrow the field to individuals with a genetic connection to the DNA found at Pamela's murder scene. The process was painstaking, involving hundreds of hours of analysis, data cross-referencing, and meticulous verification to ensure accuracy. Eventually, the investigation pointed to a single individual, a man who had lived in the area at the time of the murder, blending into the community unnoticed and living an outwardly ordinary life. Investigators obtained a discarded sample of his DNA, left behind on a coffee cup or cigarette butt, and compared it to the genetic material preserved from Pamela's case. The match was conclusive. Decades after the crime, law enforcement had identified the perpetrator. The arrest was executed with precision. Officers, aware of the danger posed by a man who had committed a violent crime, approached cautiously, ensuring the safety of both the public and themselves. The man was taken into custody without incident, confronted with the overwhelming evidence provided by DNA. He was unable to deny the connection, as the genetic match left no room for doubt. News of the arrest reverberated through Michigan and beyond. The resolution of Pamela Hutchinson's murder after decades reignited public interest in cold cases, highlighting the power of modern forensic science to solve crimes long thought unsolvable. Families and friends of Pamela experienced a mix of emotions: relief, grief, and the bittersweet closure that comes after years of uncertainty. For law enforcement, the case represented both a triumph and a testament to the importance of evidence preservation. Court proceedings relied heavily on DNA evidence. Forensic experts explained in detail how the samples collected decades earlier had been preserved and analyzed, producing a precise match. The reliability and statistical certainty of DNA provided the foundation for conviction, illustrating how science had transformed the investigative process. Witnesses from the original investigation, now decades older, provided testimony that contextualized the crime and reinforced the narrative reconstructed through genetic analysis. The impact of the case extended beyond the individual resolution. Cold case units began to adopt similar methodologies for other unsolved crimes, systematically re-examining evidence and utilizing DNA and genetic genealogy to identify perpetrators. Pamela's case became a model for how preserved biological material, when paired with innovation, could finally deliver justice, even after decades of stagnation. Communities in Michigan responded with a mixture of relief and reflection. Residents marveled at the precision and persistence of law enforcement, recognizing that the individual responsible for terrorizing their streets had been identified and held accountable. Public awareness of DNA technology and genealogical research grew, inspiring confidence in the potential to solve other long-standing mysteries. Meanwhile, Pamela's family sought to honor her memory, focusing on closure and the preservation of her legacy. Support networks, counseling, and community initiatives provided avenues for processing grief and trauma, helping those affected navigate the complex emotions surrounding the resolution of a decades-old murder. Her story became a reminder of both the fragility of life and the enduring power of scientific progress. As the perpetrator was convicted, the case exemplified a transformation in criminal justice. Crimes that had seemed permanently shrouded in uncertainty were now solvable through patience, technological innovation, and the unwavering commitment of investigators. The meticulous preservation of evidence from 1976, combined with modern DNA profiling, demonstrated that time alone does not erase the possibility of justice. And so, decades after that fateful summer day in 1976, Pamela Hutchinson's murder was finally resolved. Through the careful work of investigators, forensic scientists, and genealogical researchers, the man responsible was identified, arrested, and brought to account. The case stands as a testament to the convergence of persistence, science, and innovation, providing closure to a family and community that had waited far too long for justice. In the summer of 1987, the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, carried the quiet energy of a typical Midwestern summer. The streets hummed with the ordinary rhythms of city life, kids playing in backyards, neighbors exchanging greetings, and the sound of distant traffic weaving through tree-lined avenues. Amid this calm, a tragedy was quietly unfolding, one that would remain unresolved for decades and haunt the community for years to come. Jay Cook, a 23-year-old man, and Tanya Van Queilenborg, a 21-year-old woman, had met through mutual friends and were beginning to forge a relationship built on trust and companionship. On a late June evening, they decided to spend time together, unaware that this seemingly ordinary night would mark the beginning of a harrowing story that would stretch across decades. The pair set out together, Jay driving and Tanya accompanying him. They had no reason to suspect danger, no forewarning that an unseen predator was lying in wait. In the quiet neighborhoods and streets they traveled, there was nothing to suggest that tragedy was imminent. Yet, somewhere along their route, they encountered a man who would forever change the course of their lives. The perpetrator, a man who had been watching the area, seized an opportunity with cold calculation. In a swift and brutal series of actions, he abducted Jay and Tanya, taking them to a secluded location where their lives would be violently ended. The crime was meticulous, leaving behind limited evidence at the scene, though traces of the perpetrator's presence were unknowingly preserved in the form of biological material, blood, hair, and other forensic clues. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement faced an overwhelming challenge. Jay and Tanya were missing, and the lack of eyewitnesses complicated the search. Officers combed the city, questioning neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, trying to reconstruct the pair's final movements. The community, initially unaware of the events that had taken place, was soon drawn into a state of anxiety and uncertainty as news of the disappearance spread. Within days, the bodies of Jay and Tanya were discovered in a remote area outside the city. The investigation intensified, with homicide detectives meticulously cataloging the scene, photographing every detail, and collecting whatever evidence they could find. The biological material left by the perpetrator was preserved, despite the limited forensic capabilities of the time. Police relied primarily on traditional investigative methods, canvassing the area, creating sketches, checking alibis, and interviewing hundreds of potential suspects. For months, the case remained cold. The investigative team followed every lead, yet none led to the perpetrator. The preserved biological evidence, while carefully stored, could not be analyzed in the way modern science allows. The case became a source of frustration and sorrow for law enforcement and the victims' families alike, a haunting reminder of a crime that seemed destined to remain unsolved. As years turned into decades, the field of forensic science evolved dramatically. DNA profiling emerged as a powerful tool for solving violent crimes. Techniques that were unimaginable in the 1980s allowed investigators to extract genetic material from even degraded samples, generating profiles unique to an individual. Cold case units across Minnesota and the nation began revisiting unsolved cases, and Jay and Tanya's murder became a candidate for this new wave of forensic innovation. By the early 2000s, investigators had generated a DNA profile from biological evidence collected at the original crime scene. At first, searches through criminal databases yielded no matches. The perpetrator had no prior record that could link him directly to the murders. Frustration mounted, but hope remained, as investigators recognized that technology might soon catch up with the long-elusive criminal. The breakthrough arrived with the advent of genetic genealogy. Investigators submitted the DNA profile to publicly available genealogical databases, searching for distant relatives who had willingly submitted their DNA for ancestry research. By constructing detailed family trees, tracing inheritance patterns, and cross-referencing geographic history, investigators were able to narrow the field to a small group of potential suspects. Years of painstaking work culminated in the identification of a single individual, a man who had lived in the area during the late 1980s and blended seamlessly into his community. Investigators obtained a discarded sample of his DNA, left behind on a coffee cup or other personal item, and compared it to the profile preserved from the crime scene. The match was undeniable. Decades after Jay and Tanya's lives were cut short, law enforcement had identified their killer. The arrest was meticulously planned. Officers, aware of the danger posed by a perpetrator capable of committing such violent acts, approached with caution and precision. The man was taken into custody without incident, confronted with the overwhelming evidence that had emerged through both traditional investigation and cutting-edge DNA analysis. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the arrest was both shocking and relieving, signaling the end of decades of uncertainty and grief. As the case moved toward trial, the courtroom became a space where science and justice intersected. Forensic experts explained how biological evidence preserved from 1987 could now produce an exact match to the perpetrator's DNA. Witnesses recounted the original investigation, providing context and emotional resonance, while the meticulous scientific work offered a clear and indisputable link between the suspect and the crime. The conviction of the perpetrator demonstrated the extraordinary power of DNA evidence to solve cases long thought unsolvable. It validated the years of effort spent preserving evidence, re-examining leads, and applying innovative investigative techniques. For law enforcement, the case became a model of how persistence, science, and creativity could converge to bring justice decades after a crime occurred. The resolution of Jay and Tanya's murder had a profound impact on the community. Neighbors reflected on the decades of uncertainty, recalling how ordinary streets and everyday routines had been punctuated by fear and sorrow. Families who had lived with unanswered questions finally received clarity, a sense of justice restored, and the ability to honor the memory of the victims with closure. Support services and counseling programs were mobilized to assist family members and friends affected by the prolonged uncertainty. The case became a reference point for law enforcement agencies considering the potential of cold case investigations, highlighting the importance of meticulous evidence collection, preservation, and the strategic application of DNA and genealogical research. Meanwhile, the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg resonated beyond Minnesota. The case was cited in academic discussions, forensic conferences, and law enforcement training programs as an example of the transformative power of DNA in criminal investigations. The intersection of genetic science, traditional detective work, and community involvement provided a roadmap for resolving cases that had long lingered in the shadows. For the families, the decades-long wait was finally over. They could finally process grief in the context of justice served, no longer burdened by uncertainty or speculation about the identity of the person responsible for the loss of their loved ones. The arrest and conviction allowed them to honor Jay and Tanya's memory, focusing on the lives they lived rather than the tragedy of their deaths. As the years progressed, the case continued to influence law enforcement practices. The success of genetic genealogy in solving this cold case encouraged other jurisdictions to adopt similar methods, emphasizing the importance of cross-disciplinary collaboration between investigators, geneticists, and genealogists. The lessons learned from Jay and Tanya's case became a blueprint for future efforts to bring resolution to cold cases, highlighting the enduring potential of scientific innovation to rewrite outcomes that had once seemed fixed. And so, after decades of uncertainty, fear, and unresolved grief, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg's murder was finally solved. Through the careful preservation of evidence, the evolution of forensic technology, and the innovative use of genetic genealogy, the perpetrator was identified and brought to justice. The case stands as a testament to the enduring commitment of law enforcement and the transformative power of DNA, providing closure to families and communities long haunted by unanswered questions. In the sweltering summer of 1986, the streets of a small Texas town were alive with the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of passing cars. Families gathered on porches to escape the oppressive heat, children played along quiet sidewalks, and the rhythm of ordinary life persisted with the reassuring monotony of everyday routine. Among these residents was Kimberly Bryant, a young woman whose energy and independence made her well known among her peers. She had plans for the evening, seemingly ordinary activities that would, tragically, never be realized. Kimberly left her home one afternoon to visit friends and run errands, her movements marked by the casual confidence of someone familiar with her surroundings. She had no indication that danger was near, that an unseen predator was about to intersect with her life in the most violent way. The man who would ultimately commit her murder had been watching the area, understanding the patterns of local residents, and choosing the perfect moment to strike. The attack on Kimberly was sudden, brutal, and precise. Witnesses later recounted seeing an unfamiliar figure in the area, someone who moved deliberately, blending into the neighborhood with the appearance of normalcy. When Kimberly encountered him, she was taken by surprise, overpowered, and subjected to a violent assault that ended her life. The crime scene was secluded, the remnants of her struggle preserved in the form of physical and biological evidence, though forensic capabilities of the time were limited. Local law enforcement responded swiftly, securing the area and collecting whatever evidence could be salvaged. Fingerprints, hair, and bodily fluids were meticulously preserved, catalogued in the hope that someday they might prove useful. Officers interviewed neighbors, questioned friends and family, and attempted to reconstruct the final hours of Kimberly's life. Despite their efforts, the trail quickly went cold. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack, no immediate leads, and a sense of helplessness settled over the community. As weeks turned into months, investigators scoured the town for clues, examining local residents and individuals who had previously committed crimes in the area. The case became a focal point for the small town, which struggled to understand how such violence could occur within its borders. Families and friends of Kimberly were left with unanswered questions, forced to navigate grief alongside the uncertainty of never knowing who had taken her life. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, advances in forensic science began to open new avenues for investigation. DNA profiling emerged as a revolutionary tool, capable of identifying individuals through biological material with unprecedented accuracy. The evidence collected from Kimberly's murder, preserved carefully in evidence lockers, became a candidate for this new technology, though early attempts at profiling were hampered by limitations in both technique and available databases. In the early 2000s, cold case investigators revisited Kimberly's case, recognizing that modern forensic capabilities offered the potential to finally solve the decades-old crime. Biological samples collected from the original scene were re-examined, and DNA profiles were generated using techniques that had only recently become reliable. The process was meticulous, requiring careful extraction, amplification, and analysis to ensure that the resulting genetic profile was accurate and uncontaminated. Despite generating a DNA profile, initial searches against criminal databases failed to identify a match. The perpetrator had no known criminal history that would place him in law enforcement records, leaving investigators frustrated but not defeated. Cold case detectives turned to innovative methods, integrating DNA analysis with genealogical research to identify potential suspects through familial connections. Genetic genealogy became the key to breaking the case. Investigators submitted the DNA profile from the crime scene to publicly available genealogy databases, searching for distant relatives who had voluntarily provided their genetic information for ancestry research. By mapping out family trees and cross-referencing locations, ages, and other demographic details, investigators were able to narrow the field to a small group of individuals who could potentially be the perpetrator. After months of painstaking work, a single individual emerged as the likely suspect, a man who had lived in the area at the time of the crime, appearing outwardly ordinary, blending seamlessly into the community. Investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample from him, perhaps from a cup or cigarette butt, and compared it to the profile from Kimberly's murder scene. The match was unequivocal, confirming what investigators had long hoped. The perpetrator had been identified decades after the crime. The arrest was carefully orchestrated. Law enforcement approached the suspect with caution, aware of the violent nature of his past actions. He was taken into custody without incident, confronted with the overwhelming evidence linking him directly to Kimberly's murder. For her family, the arrest marked the culmination of decades of uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions. The perpetrator's identification brought a sense of closure that had long eluded those closest to Kimberly. The case then moved to the courtroom, where the weight of DNA evidence took center stage. Forensic experts explained how biological material preserved for decades could now provide an exact match to an individual, demonstrating both the reliability of modern techniques and the foresight of investigators who had preserved the samples. The court proceedings highlighted the remarkable evolution of criminal justice, where decades-old evidence could finally illuminate truth and accountability. The conviction of the perpetrator demonstrated the transformative power of DNA and genetic genealogy. Crimes that once seemed permanently shrouded in mystery were now solvable, and the successful resolution of Kimberly's case inspired other cold case units across Texas and the United States. Investigators recognized that the persistence of evidence preservation, combined with innovation in forensic science, could bring justice in even the oldest unsolved cases. The impact on the community was profound. Residents reflected on the decades of uncertainty and fear, realizing that the individual responsible for a violent act in their midst had finally been held accountable. Public awareness of the importance of DNA and genealogical research grew, encouraging support for cold case investigations and fostering trust in the power of science to deliver justice. Meanwhile, Kimberly's family began the difficult process of moving forward. The closure provided by the arrest and conviction allowed them to grieve in the context of justice served. Community support, counseling, and commemorative efforts helped honor her memory, focusing on the life she had lived rather than the tragedy of her death. Her story became a poignant reminder of the enduring relevance of evidence preservation and the hope that justice can arrive even after decades. Law enforcement agencies documented every detail of the investigation, preserving the chronology of events, the DNA analysis, and the methods used to identify the perpetrator. The case became a model for the integration of traditional investigative techniques with modern forensic science, emphasizing the importance of persistence, innovation, and collaboration across disciplines. As the years progressed, Kimberly Bryant's murder continued to influence both policy and practice. Cold case units adopted genetic genealogy as a standard tool in investigations, understanding that even crimes committed decades earlier could be resolved with the right combination of science and detective work. The lessons learned from this case extended beyond Texas, shaping the approach of law enforcement agencies nationally and internationally. And so, decades after that sweltering summer day in 1986, the murder of Kimberly Bryant was finally solved. Through the careful preservation of evidence, the application of advanced DNA technology, and the innovative use of genealogical research, the individual responsible for her death was identified, arrested, and brought to justice. The case stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators, the power of science, and the enduring hope that even the coldest of cases can be solved. In the autumn of 1974, the vast plains and dense forests of Alberta stretched endlessly, a landscape both serene and unforgiving. Small towns dotted the countryside, their populations tightly knit, where neighbors knew each other's routines, and life moved at a predictable, steady pace. Among the residents of one such community was Shirley Soucy, a young indigenous woman, whose life was marked by quiet ambition, close family ties, and a presence that lit up the lives of those around her. Shirley had spent her days navigating the rhythms of rural Alberta, connecting with friends and family, and contributing to her community. On a crisp October evening, she set out for an ordinary walk along familiar roads, unaware that a predator lurked nearby. The vast openness of the land, which offered both beauty and solitude, also provided an opportunity for someone with malicious intent to strike unnoticed. That night, Shirley encountered her assailant. The attack was sudden and violent, executed with an alarming degree of precision. She was overpowered, and her life was taken in an act of brutality that shocked the small town when the discovery was made. Her body was found days later in a remote area, hidden from sight, a tragic reminder of how quickly a sense of safety could be shattered. Local authorities responded quickly, documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and attempting to reconstruct the events that had led to Shirley's death. Hairs, fibers, and other biological traces were collected and preserved, though forensic science at the time was limited. Investigators relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, neighborhood canvassing, and basic profiling, but the crime remained shrouded in uncertainty. In the immediate aftermath, the community was gripped by fear and disbelief. Residents questioned how such violence could occur so close to home, and the disappearance of Shirley became a topic of constant conversation and worry. Family members struggled to cope with the sudden and inexplicable loss, while law enforcement faced the daunting task of piecing together a crime with almost no leads. Despite their best efforts, the case went cold, lingering unresolved for decades. For years, Shirley's murder became one of many unsolved cases in Alberta. Investigators revisited leads occasionally, but progress was limited by the technological constraints of the time. The evidence, however, was meticulously preserved, stored in secure evidence lockers, and catalogued for future analysis. This careful preservation would ultimately prove critical in the decades to come, when advances in forensic science would breathe new life into the case. By the early 2000s, DNA profiling had transformed the landscape of criminal investigation. Techniques that could extract and analyze genetic material with precision allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected decades earlier. Shirley's case, with its preserved biological evidence, became a candidate for this new wave of forensic innovation. Samples of hair and other trace biological material were analyzed, generating a DNA profile that could potentially identify the perpetrator. Initial searches against law enforcement databases did not produce a match. The perpetrator had no criminal record that could link him directly to the crime, leaving investigators to consider alternative approaches. This led them to the emerging field of genetic genealogy, which involved comparing DNA from crime scenes with profiles submitted to publicly accessible ancestry databases. By identifying relatives of the suspect, investigators could construct family trees and narrow the pool of potential perpetrators. The work was painstaking. Genealogists and investigators spent months analyzing family connections, geographic locations, and historical records to trace potential suspects. Every lead required verification, every detail cross-checked to ensure accuracy. The meticulous process, blending science with traditional detective work, gradually brought clarity to what had once seemed an unsolvable case. Eventually, the investigation focused on a single individual, a man who had lived in the region at the time of the murder, who appeared outwardly ordinary and had never been suspected of such violence. Investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample from him, left on a coffee cup or cigarette, and compared it to the preserved genetic material from the crime scene. The match was definitive. After more than 4 decades, law enforcement had identified Shirley's killer. The arrest was executed with care and precision. Officers approached the suspect cautiously, aware of the violent nature of the original crime. He was taken into custody without incident, confronted with the overwhelming evidence linking him directly to Shirley's murder. For her family and community, the arrest marked a moment of profound relief and emotional release, finally providing closure after decades of uncertainty. As the case moved toward trial, the focus shifted to the courtroom, where the power of DNA evidence was presented in detail. Forensic experts described how biological material preserved for decades had allowed for a precise match, and the statistical certainty of the results left no room for doubt. Witnesses from the original investigation provided context, recounting the events surrounding Shirley's disappearance and murder, while the scientific evidence delivered irrefutable proof of the perpetrator's identity. The conviction demonstrated the transformative power of DNA and genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. Crimes that had once seemed permanently unsolvable were now within reach, providing hope for families who had endured long-term uncertainty. Shirley Susse's case became a model for law enforcement agencies in Canada and beyond, illustrating the importance of preserving evidence and embracing innovative investigative techniques. The community responded with a mix of relief and reflection. Residents considered the decades of fear and uncertainty that had followed Shirley's death, recognizing the extraordinary patience and skill required to finally bring her killer to justice. The resolution reinforced public confidence in law enforcement and highlighted the value of scientific advancements in the pursuit of justice. For Shirley's family, the resolution offered an opportunity to grieve with closure. Counseling, community support, and memorial initiatives helped them navigate the complex emotions surrounding her long-unsolved murder. The case allowed them to focus on celebrating her life rather than dwelling solely on the circumstances of her death, providing a sense of healing that had been delayed for over 40 years. Law enforcement agencies documented the entire investigative process, preserving a detailed account of the methods used to identify the perpetrator. The case became a teaching example, demonstrating how traditional investigative diligence could be combined with cutting-edge forensic science to solve crimes long thought unsolvable. The lessons learned informed procedures for handling evidence, approaching cold cases, and incorporating genetic genealogy into modern investigative practice. Over time, Shirley Susse's murder continued to influence public policy and law enforcement strategy. Cold case units increasingly recognized the potential of preserved biological evidence, understanding that even decades-old crimes could yield answers with the right combination of science and detective work. The case reinforced the principle that time alone does not erase the possibility of justice, providing inspiration for similar investigations across Canada and internationally. And so, decades after the autumn day in 1974 when Shirley Susse's life was tragically cut short, the careful work of investigators, the evolution of forensic science, and the innovative use of genetic genealogy converged to identify and apprehend her killer. The case stands as a testament to persistence, scientific ingenuity, and the enduring hope that justice, no matter how delayed, can ultimately be achieved. In the early summer of 2011, the town of Zeeland, Michigan, carried the quiet rhythm of small-town life. Streets were lined with modest homes, children played in yards, and neighbors exchanged familiar greetings across fences. Among them was Connie Hiringa, a 24-year-old woman known for her warmth, humor, and love of music. She had recently moved back to Zeeland after completing her studies, eager to reconnect with family and friends and build a life in the community she had grown up in. On the evening of May 18, 2011, Connie left a friend's home to return to her own apartment. She had no indication that this night would mark a tragic turning point. Her path home was a route she had traveled countless times, familiar and unremarkable, yet it would become the setting for a violent encounter that would shake the town to its core. Connie encountered her assailant under circumstances that remain unclear, but the result was devastating. She was abducted, and her life was violently taken. The town's residents would soon learn that the quiet streets they had trusted were now the backdrop for a crime that would leave a lasting impact. Her body was discovered days later in a secluded area, a short distance from her home. Law enforcement quickly secured the scene and began the painstaking work of gathering evidence. Investigators meticulously cataloged every detail: footprints, tire tracks, discarded objects, and crucially, biological material that would later prove pivotal. Hair, fibers, and bodily fluids were collected with care, stored in evidence lockers with an eye toward preserving them for potential forensic analysis. Witnesses were interviewed, family and friends provided context about her last known movements, and the community grappled with the shock of the crime. Despite the collection of physical evidence, the investigation faced significant challenges. Connie's disappearance and murder did not provide clear leads, and initial efforts to identify a suspect proved fruitless. Law enforcement canvassed the area, examined traffic and surveillance records, and interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses. Still, the case began to grow cold, leaving the town and Connie's family in a state of grief and frustration. Forensic technology at the time offered limited options. DNA testing had advanced considerably by 2011, but matching a profile to a suspect required either a prior criminal record or an existing sample in law enforcement databases. Connie's killer had no such record, leaving investigators with a profile but no match. The case became part of the Zeeland Police Department's cold case roster, a haunting reminder that even with evidence, resolution was not guaranteed. The investigation remained largely dormant for several years. Yet the preserved DNA profile provided a critical lifeline. By 2017, advances in genetic genealogy had begun to transform the landscape of cold case investigation. Investigators, now familiar with methods used to solve older crimes, began exploring the possibility of using genealogy databases to identify potential relatives of unknown suspects. Connie Hiringa's case became a candidate for this innovative approach. The work was painstaking. Genetic genealogists examined the DNA profile from the crime scene, comparing it to publicly available profiles submitted for ancestry research. By identifying distant relatives and constructing family trees, investigators could narrow the field to potential suspects who fit the profile both genetically and geographically. Every lead required verification. Every branch of the genealogical tree had to be scrutinized for accuracy. After months of meticulous research, investigators identified a likely suspect, a man who had lived in the area at the time of the murder, and who maintained a low profile in the community. To confirm the connection, officers obtained a discarded DNA sample from the suspect, left on a coffee cup or another personal item, and compared it to the preserved crime scene DNA. The match was conclusive. Decades-old investigative barriers had been overcome, and Connie's killer was identified. The arrest was carried out with careful planning. Officers approached the suspect with caution, aware of his potential for violence and the gravity of the crime. He was taken into custody without incident, confronted with the overwhelming evidence provided by DNA analysis and genealogical research. For Connie's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and disbelief, finally offering the long-awaited answers to questions that had haunted them since 2011. Court proceedings focused heavily on the DNA evidence. Forensic experts explained how biological material preserved from the crime scene allowed investigators to produce an exact genetic match to the suspect. The statistical certainty of the DNA profile left no room for doubt. Witnesses from the original investigation provided context, recounting Connie's last known movements and the initial investigative efforts, while the forensic evidence confirmed the identity of the perpetrator. The conviction demonstrated the transformative power of DNA and genetic genealogy in solving modern cold cases. It highlighted the ability to bridge gaps left by traditional investigative methods, particularly in cases where suspects had no prior criminal record. Connie Hiringa's case became a model for how small-town law enforcement could leverage technological advances to solve violent crimes and provide justice for victims and families. The impact on the Zeeland community was profound. Residents reflected on the years of uncertainty following Connie's murder, recognizing the extraordinary persistence and skill of investigators who had refused to let the case fade into obscurity. The successful resolution reinforced public trust in law enforcement, while also drawing attention to the potential of scientific innovation in criminal justice. For Connie's family, the resolution offered closure that had been denied for years. Counseling, community support, and commemorative efforts helped them process grief and honor her memory. The arrest and conviction allowed them to shift focus from the trauma of her murder to the life she had lived, celebrating her personality, ambitions, and the relationships she had cherished. Law enforcement agencies documented the case meticulously. creating a comprehensive record of both the original investigation and the modern breakthrough. The case became a teaching example, demonstrating how evidence preservation, DNA profiling, and genetic genealogy could converge to solve crimes previously thought unsolvable. Lessons learned from Connie Hiringa's case informed policies and procedures for handling evidence, conducting genealogical investigations, and approaching cold cases with innovation and persistence. As the years progressed, the case continued to influence the field of law enforcement. Cold case units recognized the potential of combining traditional detective work with modern forensic techniques, understanding that even cases only a few years old could benefit from genetic genealogy. Connie's story illustrated how perseverance, scientific progress, and meticulous investigative work could transform the prospects of justice, providing hope for other unsolved crimes. And so, the 2011 murder of Connie Hiringa, which had left a small Michigan town in shock, was finally solved. Through the careful preservation of biological evidence, the evolution of DNA technology, and the innovative use of genealogical research, law enforcement identified and apprehended the perpetrator. The case stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators, the power of scientific innovation, and the enduring possibility of justice, even in cases that initially seem unsolvable. In the summer of 1982, the boroughs of New York City were alive with the energy of everyday life. Children played in the streets, cars honked along bustling avenues, and neighbors exchanged greetings across stoops and porches. Amid this urban hum, Josephine Ross, a 29-year-old woman, navigated her daily routine, commuting to work and maintaining connections with friends and family. Known for her kindness and determination, Josephine had aspirations that extended beyond her immediate surroundings, yet her life was tragically cut short by an act of violence that would remain unsolved for decades. On a warm evening in July, Josephine left her workplace to return home. She followed familiar streets, confident in her routine and unaware that a danger lurked nearby. A man, watching her movements, seized an opportunity with calculated intent. The attack was swift, violent, and deliberate, leaving her body in a secluded location where it would later be discovered. Her death sent shockwaves through the community, as neighbors struggled to reconcile the reality of such a violent crime with the ordinary backdrop of their daily lives. Local law enforcement responded promptly. Officers secured the area, collected physical evidence, and began the painstaking work of documenting every detail. Hair, fibers, and biological samples were carefully preserved, catalogued, and stored. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed witnesses, and attempted to reconstruct Josephine's final moments, but the case quickly presented significant challenges. There were no clear eyewitnesses to the attack, no immediate leads, and few clues pointing to the identity of the perpetrator. Despite exhaustive efforts, the investigation grew cold. Over time, detectives revisited potential suspects, reviewed witness statements, and examined known offenders in the area, but progress remained elusive. Josephine's family, friends, and the broader community were left grappling with grief and frustration, their questions unanswered, and the perpetrator unaccounted for. The case became emblematic of the many unsolved murders that haunted the city during the early 1980s. In the decades that followed, forensic science underwent transformative changes. DNA profiling emerged as a revolutionary tool, capable of identifying individuals through biological material with extraordinary precision. Though the technology was not available in 1982, the evidence collected from Josephine's murder had been meticulously preserved, offering a future opportunity for investigators to finally solve the case. By the early 2000s, cold case units in New York began systematically revisiting unsolved murders, examining preserved evidence with modern DNA techniques. Josephine Ross's case was among those selected for renewed attention. Forensic scientists extracted DNA from biological material collected at the original crime scene, generating a profile that could potentially identify the perpetrator. Initial database searches yielded no matches. The perpetrator had no criminal record or prior arrests that would place him in the system, leaving investigators with a profile but no clear leads. The case remained in the cold case roster, a haunting reminder of a crime committed decades earlier. Yet investigators remained committed, knowing that advances in forensic science might eventually provide answers. The breakthrough came through the application of genetic genealogy, a method that compares DNA profiles from crime scenes to publicly available genealogical databases. Investigators submitted the DNA from Josephine's case to these databases, seeking distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their information. By constructing detailed family trees and tracing inheritance patterns, they could narrow the field of potential suspects and locate individuals who fit both genetically and geographically. Months of painstaking research followed. Genealogists and investigators carefully examined family histories, cross-referenced geographic locations, and validated connections to ensure accuracy. Each lead was scrutinized, every branch of the family tree analyzed. This meticulous process gradually brought clarity to a case that had seemed unsolvable, slowly narrowing the field to a single individual who had lived in the city at the time of the murder and maintained an outwardly ordinary life. Investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample from the suspect, perhaps left on a coffee cup, cigarette, or another personal item, and compared it to the preserved DNA from Josephine's crime scene. The results were definitive. Decades after the murder, law enforcement had finally identified the individual responsible. The arrest marked a pivotal moment for the city, the family, and the investigators who had refused to abandon the case. The arrest was carried out with care and precision. Officers approached the suspect with caution, aware of his capacity for violence and the gravity of the crime. He was taken into custody without incident and confronted with the overwhelming genetic evidence. For Josephine's family, the arrest provided a mix of relief, grief, and validation. Finally, after decades of uncertainty, the individual responsible had been held accountable. Court proceedings highlighted the role of DNA in securing justice. Forensic experts detailed how biological material collected in 1982 had been preserved and analyzed, producing a precise match to the perpetrator. The statistical certainty of the DNA evidence left no room for doubt, while witnesses from the original investigation provided context, recounting Josephine's final movements and the efforts made to locate her killer. The conviction illustrated the transformative power of DNA and genetic genealogy in solving cold cases, demonstrating how a combination of persistence, innovation, and scientific advancement could bridge decades of investigative gaps. Josephine Ross's case became a benchmark for law enforcement agencies seeking to resolve long-standing murders, providing hope to families and communities affected by similar tragedies. The impact on the community was profound. Residents reflected on the years of uncertainty and fear that had followed Josephine's murder, recognizing the determination and skill of investigators who had refused to allow time to erase the pursuit of justice. Public awareness of DNA technology and genetic genealogy grew, reinforcing the potential for scientific innovation to resolve crimes once thought permanently unsolvable. For Josephine's family, the case's resolution allowed them to grieve with closure. Support networks, counseling, and community initiatives helped them navigate the complex emotions surrounding the decades-long uncertainty. The arrest and conviction enabled them to shift their focus from the trauma of her death to the life she had lived, honoring her memory and legacy. Law enforcement agencies meticulously documented the investigation, preserving a comprehensive record of both the original efforts and the modern forensic breakthrough. The case became a teaching example, demonstrating the intersection of traditional investigative diligence and cutting-edge forensic science. Lessons from Josephine Ross's case informed procedures for evidence preservation, the application of genetic genealogy, and strategies for resolving cold cases that had long remained unsolved. Over time, the resolution of Josephine's murder influenced policy and practice in law enforcement. Cold case units recognized the importance of preserving biological evidence and the potential of modern forensic methods to solve both recent and decades-old crimes. The case reinforced the principle that time alone does not prevent justice, providing inspiration for investigators across New York, the United States, and beyond. And so, decades after that summer evening in 1982 when Josephine Ross's life was tragically taken, the convergence of careful evidence preservation, the evolution of DNA technology, and the innovative use of genetic genealogy finally led to justice. Her killer was identified, arrested, and convicted, bringing closure to a family and community long haunted by uncertainty. The case stands as a testament to the power of persistence, science, and the enduring hope that even the coldest of cases can be solved. In the spring of 1988, the sun cast long, golden rays across the suburban streets of Sacramento, California. The neighborhoods were quiet in the mornings, punctuated only by the sound of birds, distant traffic, and the laughter of children playing in yards. Among the residents moving through their daily routines was Angela Hammond, a 26-year-old woman whose life had been marked by ambition, independence, and strong connections with family and friends. Angela was a person of routine and care, her movements familiar to neighbors and friends alike, a familiarity that made the violence she would soon encounter all the more shocking. On a warm afternoon, Angela left her home to run errands and visit friends. She followed familiar streets, confident in her surroundings, unaware that a predator had been observing her, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The attack that followed was sudden, violent, and deliberate, leaving little trace except for the evidence that would be preserved at the scene: hair, fibers, and biological material that would later prove critical in the long search for her killer. When Angela's body was discovered later that day, local authorities responded swiftly. Officers secured the scene, documented every detail, and collected the physical evidence with meticulous care. Investigators conducted extensive interviews with neighbors, friends, and family, attempting to reconstruct her final hours and identify any potential suspect. Despite these efforts, there were few immediate leads. The crime scene provided no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, and no immediate connection to any known offenders. As the investigation unfolded, the community of Sacramento grappled with shock and fear. The idea that someone within their familiar streets could commit such a violent act was deeply unsettling. Family and friends struggled with grief, anger, and a pervasive sense of uncertainty. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, canvassing the area, examining traffic records, interviewing hundreds of potential witnesses, and following up on leads that often ended in dead ends. Yet, as weeks became months, and months turned into years, the case grew cold. Forensic technology at the time offered limited tools. Investigators preserved every piece of biological evidence, understanding that advances in science might one day allow for further analysis. Hair and blood samples were carefully stored in evidence lockers, cataloged and protected, awaiting the day when technological innovation could breathe new life into the case. By the early 2000s, DNA profiling had become a powerful tool in criminal investigations. Cold case units across California began revisiting unsolved murders, utilizing these techniques to examine previously collected evidence. Angela Hammond's case was among those re-examined. Forensic scientists successfully extracted DNA from samples preserved for decades, producing a genetic profile that could be used to identify the perpetrator. Despite having a DNA profile, initial searches against criminal databases yielded no matches. The perpetrator had no prior record that would place him in law enforcement systems, leaving investigators with a genetic profile but no suspect. The case remained unresolved, a reminder of both the tragedy of Angela's death and the limits of traditional investigative tools. Yet investigators remained determined, knowing that new techniques might eventually lead to answers. The breakthrough came with the application of genetic genealogy. Investigators submitted the DNA profile from the crime scene to publicly available genealogical databases, searching for distant relatives of the unknown perpetrator. By constructing family trees and tracing inheritance patterns, investigators could narrow the pool of potential suspects, identifying individuals whose genetic connections suggested they could be responsible. Months of meticulous research followed. Genealogists and investigators worked together, examining family histories, geographic locations, and demographic information to validate leads. Each branch of the genealogical tree was scrutinized, every connection verified. Slowly, the process revealed a likely suspect, a man who had lived in the Sacramento area at the time of Angela's murder, blending seamlessly into the community, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary life. To confirm the connection, investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample from the suspect, left on a cup, cigarette, or other personal item, and compared it to the DNA preserved from Angela's murder scene. The match was definitive. Decades after the crime, law enforcement had identified her killer. The arrest brought a mix of relief and disbelief to the community, whose residents had long wondered if justice would ever be served. The arrest was executed with precision. Officers approached the suspect cautiously, aware of the violent nature of the original crime. He was taken into custody without incident, confronted with the overwhelming DNA evidence linking him directly to Angela Hammond's murder. For her family, the arrest marked a turning point, bringing closure to decades of grief, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. Court proceedings emphasized the central role of DNA evidence in the resolution of the case. Forensic experts explained how biological material collected decades earlier had been preserved and analyzed, producing a precise match to the perpetrator. The statistical certainty of the DNA analysis left no room for doubt, while witnesses from the original investigation provided context, recounting Angela's movements and the early efforts to identify her killer. The conviction illustrated the extraordinary potential of DNA and genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. Crimes once thought permanently unsolvable could now be revisited and resolved, offering hope to families who had endured long-term uncertainty. Angela Hammond's case became a benchmark for law enforcement agencies seeking to resolve long-standing murders, demonstrating how persistence, innovation, and scientific advancement could converge to bring justice. The impact on the Sacramento community was profound. Residents reflected on the years of uncertainty and fear, recognizing the dedication and skill of investigators who refused to abandon the case. The resolution reinforced public confidence in law enforcement and highlighted the potential of forensic innovation to deliver justice, even decades after a crime. For Angela's family, the case's resolution allowed them to grieve with closure. Counseling, community support, and commemorative efforts helped them navigate the emotional complexity of losing a loved one to a crime that remained unresolved for so long. The arrest and conviction allowed them to honor Angela's life rather than remain focused solely on the tragedy of her death. Law enforcement agencies meticulously documented the investigative process, preserving a comprehensive record of both the original investigation and the modern forensic breakthrough. The case became a teaching example, demonstrating how the combination of traditional investigative diligence and cutting-edge science could solve crimes long left in uncertainty. Lessons learned from Angela Hammond's case informed protocols for evidence preservation, genealogical investigation, and cold case resolution. Over time, the resolution of Angela's murder influenced both law enforcement strategy and public policy. Cold case units increasingly recognized the power of preserved biological evidence and modern forensic techniques to solve crimes, reinforcing the principle that time alone does not prevent justice. Angela's story inspired investigators nationwide to pursue similar cases with renewed determination and innovative approaches. And so, decades after the spring evening in 1988 when Angela Hammond's life was tragically taken, the convergence of careful evidence preservation, DNA technology, and genetic genealogy finally brought her killer to justice. The case stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators, the power of scientific innovation, and the enduring hope that even the oldest cold cases can ultimately be solved, providing closure to families and communities long haunted by uncertainty. Sounds of everyday life, the distant hum of cars, the chatter of neighbors, and the laughter of children playing on sidewalks. Among the residents was Linda Kimball, a 22-year-old woman whose life was full of promise, ambition, and connections with friends and family. She had grown up in the area, known for her kindness and determination, and had recently moved into her own apartment, beginning a chapter of independence that many young people in the town could relate to. On a late June evening, Linda left her home to visit a friend, a brief outing that was routine and ordinary. She moved through familiar streets, confident in her surroundings and unaware that a predator had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attack that would follow was swift, brutal, and precise, leaving her body in a secluded area where it would later be discovered by passers-by. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the town, shaking the sense of safety residents had taken for granted and leaving the community in mourning. Local law enforcement quickly responded, officers secured the crime scene, documenting every detail with careful attention. Biological material, including hair, blood, and other trace evidence, was collected and meticulously preserved, catalogued for potential future analysis. Investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members, attempting to piece together the last known movements of Linda and identify potential suspects. Despite these efforts, the crime presented significant challenges. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack, few immediate leads, and no clear motive to guide the investigation. For months, detectives pursued every avenue. They canvassed the neighborhood, examined local residents with criminal histories, and followed tips from the public. Still, the case remained unsolved. As time passed, it grew colder, leaving Linda's family and the community in a state of enduring grief and frustration. The preserved evidence, however, remained a beacon of hope, an opportunity for future science to unlock answers that had eluded investigators for decades. The 1980s and 1990s saw rapid advancements in forensic technology. DNA profiling emerged as a revolutionary tool, capable of identifying individuals with remarkable precision. Though this technology was unavailable in 1979, the careful preservation of Linda's biological evidence would prove critical in the years to come. By the early 2000s, investigators revisited her case, applying modern DNA analysis techniques to the samples collected decades earlier. Forensic scientists successfully generated a DNA profile from the preserved material, opening a pathway to finally identify her killer. Initial searches against criminal databases yielded no matches. The perpetrator had no prior record that would place him in law enforcement systems, leaving investigators with a DNA profile but no direct suspect. The case remained unresolved, a lingering reminder of the limitations of investigative methods before the era of advanced DNA profiling. Yet investigators remained persistent, knowing that new scientific approaches could eventually provide answers. The breakthrough came with genetic genealogy, a method that compares DNA from crime scenes to publicly accessible genealogical databases. Investigators submitted the DNA from Linda's case to these databases, searching for distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their profiles for ancestry research. By constructing detailed family trees and analyzing inheritance patterns, investigators could narrow the field to a smaller group of potential suspects, identifying individuals whose genetic profiles suggested a connection to the crime. Months of painstaking work followed. Genealogists and investigators examined family histories, cross-referenced geographic locations, and validated potential connections to ensure accuracy. Each lead was carefully scrutinized, every branch of the family tree analyzed. This meticulous process gradually revealed a likely suspect, a man who had lived in the town at the time of Linda's murder, maintained a seemingly ordinary life, and had successfully evaded detection for decades. To confirm the connection, investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample from the suspect, left on a cup, cigarette, or another personal item, and compared it to the preserved crime scene DNA. The results were unequivocal. Decades after the crime, law enforcement had identified Linda Kimball's killer. The arrest marked a pivotal moment, offering the family and the community long-awaited closure and vindicating the persistence of investigators who had never abandoned the case. The arrest was executed with precision. Officers approached the suspect cautiously, fully aware of the violent nature of the original crime. He was taken into custody without incident and confronted with the overwhelming DNA evidence linking him directly to Linda's murder. For her family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief, disbelief, and emotional release, finally providing answers that had remained elusive for 40 years. Court proceedings centered on the role of DNA evidence in resolving the case. Forensic experts explained how biological material preserved for decades could now be analyzed to produce a precise match to the perpetrator. The statistical certainty of the results left no room for doubt, while witnesses from the original investigation provided context, recounting Linda's final hours and the initial investigative efforts. The combination of modern forensic science and diligent historical investigation created an unassailable case against the suspect. The conviction of Linda Kimball's killer demonstrated the extraordinary potential of DNA and genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. Crimes once thought permanently unsolvable could now be revisited and resolved, offering hope to families who had endured decades of uncertainty. Linda's case became a benchmark for law enforcement agencies, showing how persistence, innovation, and the careful preservation of evidence could converge to deliver justice. The impact on the local community was profound. Residents reflected on the decades of uncertainty and fear, recognizing the dedication and expertise of investigators who had refused to abandon the case. Public awareness of the potential of DNA technology and genetic genealogy grew, reinforcing confidence in law enforcement and highlighting the transformative power of science in criminal investigations. For Linda's family, the resolution allowed them to grieve with closure. Counseling, community support, and commemorative initiatives helped them navigate the complex emotions surrounding a decades-long unsolved murder. The arrest and conviction allowed the family to honor Linda's life, focusing on her personality, ambitions, and the connections she had cherished, rather than remaining trapped in the uncertainty of her death. Law enforcement agencies meticulously documented the investigation, creating a comprehensive record of both the original case and the modern forensic breakthrough. Linda Kimball's case became a teaching example, illustrating the intersection of traditional investigative work and cutting-edge science. Lessons learned informed procedures for evidence preservation, genetic genealogy applications, and strategies for resolving long-standing cold cases. Over time, the resolution of Linda Kimball's murder influenced both law enforcement policy and investigative practices. Cold case units recognized the value of preserved biological evidence and the transformative potential of forensic technology. The case reinforced the principle that time alone does not prevent justice, providing inspiration to investigators handling other unsolved crimes and reminding communities that persistent efforts and innovation could ultimately deliver answers. And so, decades after the summer day in 1979 when Linda Kimball's life was tragically taken, the careful preservation of evidence, the evolution of DNA technology, and the innovative use of genetic genealogy finally brought her killer to justice. Her story stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators, the power of science, and the enduring hope that even the oldest cold cases can be solved, providing closure to families and communities long haunted by uncertainty.